Hello everyone, and welcome to this After Effects tutorial. This will be a beginner's tutorial for people interested in using After Effects for animation. After Effects has a wide-ranging, lot of capabilities, everything from video editing, compositing, all kinds of effects. Even animation, character rigging and animation. So, the goal of this tutorial is, first of all, to get familiar with the interface, the workspace of After Effects. What we're going to be animating is a bouncing ball that will look something like this. Keep in mind, this is a technical lesson, more so than an animation lesson, so don't worry if your animation doesn't look that great or if my animation doesn't look that great. Also, I want to mention I'm working in After Effects CC 2017, but it shouldn't matter for what we're doing today. Whether you're on a Mac or Windows or any older version of After Effects, shouldn't matter. Also, I want to mention that I like shortcuts, so but I'll try to show you different ways of doing different things. So if you're a shortcut person, you can use the shortcuts, and if not, you don't have to. I also want to encourage you to play and explore. Remember, you can always just Control Z, undo. So here we go. So when you open up After Effects to get started, we want a new project. Now we've opened up an empty project, and your workspace should look something like this. We have different panels here. The main ones that we want to be using are the project panel, the composition panel, and the timeline down here. This is where our layers will go, and this is where our animation will happen. These extra panels I don't think we will need, so I'm just gonna move them over, give ourselves some space here. You should find tools up here at the top left. So if you don't have any of these panels open, go down to Window and look for them here. Yeah, here you go. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is create a new composition. So let's go to Composition, New Composition, or Command N. So we've opened up this composition settings window. So let's name our composition. We're gonna animate a bouncing ball, so I'm gonna call the composition bouncing ball. These presets look pretty good. I like 1920 by 1080. I like square pixels. I like 24 frames per second. I think 5 seconds is good. Okay. Black background is good to me. Okay. So we'll notice a couple of things. First of all, if we click in our composition panel, we can zoom in and out, and we see our empty black background composition. We'll also notice in our project panel, the bouncing ball composition is listed here. So now we're ready to make a bouncing ball. You know what? I'm going to zoom to fit. Okay, So I'm at 92% here. So the first thing we need is a ball, right? We need a ball, and we need a floor for the ball to bounce on, which means we need to create some shapes. So let's go up to our tools, shape tool, rectangle tool, click, hold, go down to ellipse tool, make a round shape. And on my composition, in order to make it perfectly round, I'm going to hold down shift, click and drag. So I want my ball to be about that big. Okay, so we have a circle, we have a ball. I just want to make some space here so we can look at this for a moment. So by drawing a circle, we've automatically created a new shape layer that contains our shape that we just drew, the ellipse. I also am going to want a floor for the ball to bounce on. So let's see if we can do that. Let's go back to our shape tool, grab the rectangle tool, and draw a floor. This is problematic though, since I want to animate my ball separately from the floor. If we look at our shape layer, our new rectangle exists in the contents of the same shape layer as our ellipse. We don't want that because we want to animate our ball separately. We want a unique shape layer for every shape. So let's delete this rectangle by clicking here on rectangle 1 and delete. Since we want a unique shape layer, we want a new shape layer for our rectangle, solely for our rectangle. One way to do that is to go up to Layer, New Shape Layer. We just created a new empty shape layer. If we expand down, we'll see there's nothing under its contents yet. We haven't created any shapes. We've only created a empty shape layer. Shape layer 2. Shape layer 1 has our ellipse. Shape layer 2 doesn't have any shapes yet. If we select shape layer 2 and draw our rectangle for the floor, now we have our rectangle on its own shape layer. I want to rename these shape layers, so I'm going to click on the shape layer name, hit enter or return, and for our rectangle layer I'm going to call it floor, and shape layer 1 I want to rename to ball. Okay, so far so good. Keep in mind you can always rearrange your layers by dragging them underneath each other on top of one another like so. I'm okay with this arrangement right now. I'm just going to expand this panel so we can see better. Now let's take a look at this layer, what we have here. We have contents and we have transform. And I can expand transform down. You should see a list of properties here: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. Next to the list of properties, you should find these set of controls or parameters that we are going to be able to animate. If you don't see these parameters, it might be because one of these buttons at the bottom left is not selected. We are going to circle back to them, but for now, let's just turn on the leftmost button down here. So this is all we need to view the parameters or controls for our properties that we want to animate. For the ellipse 1, under the contents of the shape layer, let's expand that. And notice that ellipse 1 has its own transform options. If we expand that, transform ellipse 1, scroll down here, I'm just going to make some space here. I'm going to collapse the floor layer. So notice that we have two sets of transform properties. We have the transform properties set for the ball shape layer, and we have a set of transform properties for the ellipse shape under the contents for that shape layer. Notice the two sets of transform properties are a little different. The ellipse transform property set has a couple of extra properties such as skew and skew axis. So I just want you to notice the difference here. We're going to mainly be animating the transform properties for the shape layer itself. If you've used another animation software like Harmony, you might be familiar with drawings and pegs. So this is kind of like peg properties versus the drawing properties. So the drawing of the ellipse itself has its own set of transform properties, but we're not going to worry about them right now, so I'm going to collapse that. One thing I do want to adjust in the ellipse itself is this ugly brown stroke that we have around it right now. I want to get rid of that stroke. Under the contents of the ball shape layer, the stroke option on the ellipse, I want to get rid of this stroke, so let's open that up. And let's bring the stroke width down to 0. There goes our stroke. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the stroke, and that's all I need for the ellipse drawing right now. That's all I need to adjust, so I'm going to collapse that. I'm going to once again select the ball shape layer itself. Now, since we're animating the ball shape layer, we want to move our anchor point where we want it. One way to do that is to come down here to the transform set of properties for our ball shape layer, and under anchor point we can reposition the layer relative to its anchor point. But an easier way to do that, rather than dragging this thing around, is to simply go up to our pan behind tool, or also known as anchor point tool, which we can also access by hitting the letter Y on the keyboard. And we can actually go ahead and click and drag the anchor point itself and place it where we want it. Now I want my anchor point near the bottom center of my shape layer, of my ball. I think I'd also like my ball a little bit bigger. So with the selection tool, which I'll access by either clicking here or hitting the V key on the keyboard, click on that ball and hold down Shift, keep it proportional, make it a little bit bigger. Okay. All right, now we have a ball. We're ready to animate this ball. Okay, so we're ready to animate. So let's get familiar with the timeline. So click down in our timeline panel. So you'll notice that our timeline is marked from 0 frames all the way up to 5 seconds. And it's marked in half-second increments. So 12 frames, that's half a second. And then 1 second of frames. And then 1 second and 12 frames, or a second and a half. 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, and 5 seconds. 5 total seconds of frames. Just make sure you're clicked in your timeline panel and hit spacebar. You'll notice this red vertical line moving across the timeline. We are previewing our animation. We're previewing the timeline. Now we don't have any animation. We haven't animated anything yet, so nothing is moving. But we'll use this to preview our animation as we go along. Notice this time code at the bottom of the composition panel that's showing our frame count as we preview. So it's counting frames 0 to 24 per second. So we can pause our preview at any point by hitting spacebar. Our playhead stops. You can scrub the playhead to scrub through your animation at any point. And I'm just going to leave that at the beginning for now. A couple of other notes about the timeline. Notice this thin gray bar with the blue ends. We can drag these blue ends, and what happens is we're zooming into our timeline with this thin gray bar. As I drag it here, we can also zoom in and out of the timeline the same way by hitting the plus and minus keys on the keyboard. Just plus and minus, zooming in, plus, zooming out, minus. So this is our time navigator bar. If I zoom in on our timeline, I can also drag this time navigator bar to zoom in on any point in the timeline. And for now, I'm just going to hit minus a few times. Just going to zoom all the way out so I can view the timeline in its entirety from 0 start to finish 5 seconds. You should notice a second gray bar, a thicker bar with blue ends, which we can also drag. This is our work area bar. I can move that all along the timeline, and I can drag that as open or closed as I'd like. Our work area bar lets us preview certain sections, whatever section we'd like to preview of our animation or of our timeline. So if I just want to preview this section of the timeline, what I can do is bring my playhead within that work area and hit spacebar. Now it's just going to preview the work area. I'll pause, and I want to note another way to preview that is on a Mac keyboard, the shortcut is Control-0. So this way the playhead scrubber does not need to be inside of the work area for you to preview the work area. my playhead can be anywhere, be located anywhere on my timeline, and by hitting Control 0, I will still only preview the work area on my timeline. So I'm going to pause the preview, drag out my work area bar back to its default. Okay, so hopefully now we're a little bit more comfortable with the different panels, with the timeline. With our shape layers. I think I like to reset the anchor point on this rectangle shape layer. So I'm gonna grab my pan behind or anchor point tool by hitting Y on the keyboard, shortcut. Can also be selected up here in the tools. Click and drag this anchor point and set it on top of my shape. I think I'd also like to change the appearance of this rectangle. So I'll collapse my ball properties, expand my floor shape layer properties, and remember to change the appearance of the shape itself, we need to go to the shape under the contents of the shape layer, expand the shape properties. I can adjust the stroke color. I think I'm going to lose the stroke. So I'll set the stroke width to 0 and collapse stroke, but I think I'd like to change the fill color on this rectangle drawing. So I'll expand fill 1, change the color here to some arbitrary gray color. Okay, so I'll collapse. Let's go ahead and collapse everything here. Okay. Floor shape layer, ball shape layer. Okay, I think we're ready to animate. What do you say? So my approach to animating this will be I want to block in my key poses and eventually in between. So a little bit about how animation works in After Effects. I want to animate this ball to bounce. Boing, boing, boing. So I'm going to want to animate its position property. And remember, we're animating the shape layer itself, not the ellipse drawing under the contents of that shape layer. That's going to remain as is. So we're going to touch the transform properties underneath the shape layer itself. And we know that we want to animate the position property. So in order to do that, we need some keyframes. So if you look at the position property here, next to position is this stopwatch icon, which if we click, we've now activated the ability to animate this property. If you look on our timeline, we now have this blue diamond shape. That's a keyframe that contains the parameters set to the position property. I can click and drag this keyframe anywhere I'd like along my timeline. For now, I want to keep it on frame 1. You should notice over here to the left of the position property is this blue diamond symbol. And I want you to notice that if I move my playhead around away from that keyframe, this diamond symbol goes gray. As long as my playhead is at the same frame where my keyframe exists, this diamond will be blue. So you know that your playhead is directly over top of your keyframe. And if you ever need to make sure whether you're on top of the keyframe, you can always zoom in with our time navigator bar. You can zoom in really close and make sure that our playhead is right on top of the keyframe. Okay, let's zoom back out. If I click away from the position property, I deselect it, I deselect the keyframe. It'll be gray, but that's okay, it's still there. I can always highlight it and select that keyframe, move it around, deselect it, it's still there. Move the playhead around, keyframe is deselected, move the playhead back onto the keyframe. This keyframe symbol is blue, so I know my playhead is directly over top of the keyframe for that property. And to create any additional keyframes, I can move my playhead anywhere along the timeline and click on the gray diamond to the left of the stopwatch on that property. There's my new keyframe. If I click on the stopwatch again, I get rid of all the keyframes on that property. So some of the basics of animating in After Effects. I have one keyframe here at the start of my timeline with a set of parameters for the position property, and I want to move this ball. So what I'm going to do is drag my playhead out to say near 2 seconds. I'm going to reposition the ball. So I'm going to click and move the ball. Let's say over here. So you'll notice a few things here. First of all, in our timeline, we have a new keyframe that was automatically placed on our timeline. And we also see an automatic even motion path. So if we drag our playhead along our timeline, we have an animation. Remember, we can preview our animation as long as we select in our timeline panel and hit either spacebar or Control-0. And if I only want to preview a desired selection of my timeline, remember, we can adjust our work area bar and just preview that selection of the timeline. Okay, I'm going to pause the preview, reset the work area bar. Now I want to show you something important here. Our keyframes are diamond shaped, which means if I select my shape layer, I can see the path created by the automatic in-betweening. There's no easing, no slowing, even motion path. For our purposes right now, we're going to want to block our animation before we're in-betweening. We want to block it. So we want to lose the automatic in-betweening between keyframes, right? So in order to do that, we need to change the kind of keyframe that we use on our timeline. Right now, this diamond-shaped keyframe symbolizes auto in-betweening. We want to change this keyframe to be what's called a hold keyframe. If I right-click on that keyframe I go to toggle hold keyframe. Notice what happens to this keyframe. It's no longer a diamond shape, but it has this flat side, which means no more auto in between. It's going to hold that position, hence the name hold keyframe. So if I scrub the playhead, it's going to hold that position until it reaches the next keyframe. This is going to be helpful when we block animation, because we want to block key poses without in-betweening them. Any keyframe that's an auto in-between keyframe, I want to toggle between a regular or a hold keyframe. I can select that keyframe. Again, you can right-click and toggle hold keyframe, or as a shortcut, select the keyframe, Option, Command, and click on that keyframe. So we've changed it from a regular auto in-between keyframe to a hold keyframe. So again, when I scrub my playhead, it's going to hold that position until it reaches the next keyframe. So I think we're ready to block our animation. Now we have our shape, we have our keyframes that let us hold our objects in position. So we're ready to block our animation. I'm going to start blocking in my key poses that I want for my bouncing ball. So I think I want my ball to start off screen and at about 1 second I want to see its first bounce. So I'll place my scrubber at 1 second and I'll move my shape to about here. Notice on your timeline we have a new keyframe. This is a hold keyframe, and we know that because it has flat edges as opposed to a diamond shaped auto in-between keyframe, which we can always toggle to either with shortcut Option Command click or by right clicking on that keyframe, toggle hold keyframe. Don't worry about whether it's a square or it's a half diamond, half square. As long as the keyframes on either side of it are hold keyframes, we're okay. So I want to preview this animation so far. I'm going to set my work area bar to around there and Control 0 to preview. So far so good. Pause that preview, reset my work area bar. By the way, a shortcut for adjusting your work area bar along your timeline are letters B for beginning and the letter N for end. B for beginning, N for end. Or you can just click and drag the ends of the work area bar. All right, let's keep going with blocking in our animation. I'm going to roughly continue blocking this in here by moving around my keyframes, moving around my shape. So this is sort of approximated. Let's just preview and see what that looks like right now. some bounce points. So remember, wherever I set my playhead and move my shape, it's going to automatically generate a new keyframe. You can also create a new keyframe by setting your playhead anywhere on the timeline and clicking on that diamond to the left of the position property. As long as it's gray and I click it, it's going to create a new keyframe wherever I set my playhead. So if I want a new keyframe over here, in this empty region on my timeline, click the gray diamond, add a new keyframe, a new position property keyframe. So that's a new hold keyframe, since the previous keyframe is also a hold keyframe. I want to note that in your After Effects timeline, it's really easy to miss the mark when it comes to positioning your playhead where you want to place it. But remember that you know you're on top of a keyframe when the diamond to the left of the property turns blue. Also remember that you can always zoom in on your timeline with the time navigator bar. So we can zoom in nice and close. This way we know exactly which frame our playhead is on. Zoom out. We can also, as we scrub our playhead along the timeline, by holding Shift, that thing is going to lock to the nearest keyframe. So that's going to help us with placing our playhead where we want it to go. So let's keep going with blocking in our animation here. You can take your time adjusting your path and your key positions. I want to note that you can always adjust your key positions in your composition by simply moving the points around. Keep that in mind. At this point I have some of my major key positions blocked out for our ball bounce. I'm just going to preview this and see what that looks like. Okay, I think I want to move this position a little bit lower. Okay, I think so far so good. I think I'm pretty happy with this so far. I think I want to go in and block a few more of the intermediate key positions. So what I'm doing here is I'm going halfway in time between the down bounce position and the highest point in the bounce, halfway between them, and reposition my ball to sort of create this decelerating arc. I think I'm going to need to adjust timing here. But let's see what that looks like so far. Alright, not too bad. Could be worse. think I want to adjust the timing towards the end of the bouncing here because I think it's a little too slow. So what I want to do is move my keyframes a little bit closer to each other. I'm going to stop to point out a few keyboard shortcuts for you. To easily move selected keyframes forward or back in time along your timeline, you can select whichever keyframes you like by holding Alt, using the left and right arrows. You can move these keyframes forward and back in time along your timeline. Or if I select a frame and I hold Alt Shift, that'll let me skip 10 frames. Let's see where I'm at here. Let's preview. Getting there. I can also simply scrub my playhead rather than holding down the mouse and dragging it. I can hold Command and use the left and right arrows. That'll let me scroll through my timeline. Or adding Command Shift, let me skip 10 frames as I scroll through the timeline. Okay, so at this point, all right, let's preview this one more time. But rather than previewing this entire timeline, I just want to set my work area to this area. Let's preview that, Control 0. I think I'm pretty happy with that for now. So, which means that I'm ready to in-between. So to in-between, all we need to do, remember, is to reset these keyframes back to auto in-between mode rather than right now they are in hold mode. Right now these are hold keyframes. I want to set them back to the auto in-between. Remember those diamond shapes. So I want to select all of the keyframes, which I can do by clicking on the position property. That'll select all of the keyframes for that property along the timeline. Or I can simply make a selection here and select all of them. Now with all of my keyframes, all my position property keyframes selected, I can use the shortcut Alt Command click, or I can right click on the keyframes, toggle hold keyframe, Now that sets it back to auto in between. Notice now that they're all diamond shaped, they're all auto in between. Our paths are back. And if I scrub the playhead along the timeline, you can see that the ball is moving. The ball is moving along the motion path throughout the timeline. Every frame is filled. But we have some wonky stuff going on here. We want to fix that. In fact, we want to add Bezier curves since we want our motion path to be curved, right? Like a bouncing ball. We want parabolic curves, right? To simulate gravity. So we want to adjust the Bezier handles on pretty much every one of these points, right? I can do that with my pen tool, which you can access by hitting G on the keyboard. So notice I have all of my keyframes selected. So if I click on just one of the points, it will actually sort of reset the Bezier curves, Bezier handles on every point. So that's nice. I want to sort of adjust them individually at this point. So I'm just going to click away, use my selection tool to click on the points individually, and with my pen tool, G, so I can adjust the Bezier handles, Bezier curves. You might find that for some Bezier handles you have to hold down Alt and adjust the handle itself to avoid locking the two sides of the two handles together. Hold down Alt. It's a little finicky, but hopefully you manage. Go to this point. It's already kind of. Let's preview this and see what that looks like. Okay. Okay, I think my timing needs a little bit of work. Timing and positioning needs a little bit of work. Pause preview. Now I can still go through and adjust the positioning and the timing. So I'm gonna work on this a little bit. Now, as with any animation, it takes a little bit of finessing. I know I'm speeding through this. I want you to take your time, pause the video if you have to. Here's another useful shortcut to skip directly to previous or next keyframe rather than sort of holding shift and looking for that keyframe. You can use shortcuts J and K. That'll skip your playhead directly to the next keyframe. K for next keyframe, J for previous keyframe. Alright, so just checking in here. I've made some adjustments to timing out my keyframes, positioning the ball at the different points along my timeline. And when I preview, I've got a bouncing ball. So hopefully you've got a working animation at this point, a ball bouncing. If not, you can pause the video here, take your time, make any necessary adjustments to your motion path, to positioning your ball where you need it to. I want to move on to a polishing stage. To polish this animation, there are three things that I want to add to make this ball bounce look really polished. Those three things are, firstly, a little bit of skewing, a little bit of squash and stretch. So right now our ball is a solid shape. That shape does not change. Second thing is sound effect. I want a bouncing sound. So we're going to add a sound file. And the third thing, lastly, is going to be motion blur. That's going to be a super simple polishing touch at the end. So I want to start with working a little bit of skew, a little bit of squash and stretch into our ball. Now to do that, if you remember, let's expand our ball information here. If you remember, we have our transform properties for our ball shape layer, but under contents, under our ellipse drawing, the ellipse drawing has its own set of transform properties. And if you remember, that set of transform properties has a skew property. So that's what we're going to use to, we're going to animate a little bit of skew into this. So to do that, there's nothing new here. We're basically just going to add some keyframes and make some adjustments to the appearance of our ball. So I think I want my ball to skew in and out of some of these positions. So let's go ahead and create a new skew keyframe by clicking that stopwatch next to the skew property. Now, as we see, we've created a new skew keyframe with 0 skew. Pretty sure I'm going to want the bulk of the skew to be happening in the down motion and in the up motion, but I'm going to want 0 skew at the top and bottom of my arcs. So let's put our 0 skew keyframe at the top of my arc. I'm going to want to align the keyframes of different properties just to stay organized for now. So remember, I can skip to the next keyframe on my timeline by hitting K. So I know that I'm in line with this column of frames. This will help me stay organized, help me stay in line working in a column-like workflow. So now I can add a little bit of skew to this frame. I can click my gray diamond shape over here to the left of the property that I want to animate, or I can simply adjust the parameters and it's going to automatically create a new keyframe. So if I add some skew to this, think maybe 15 degrees, there's a new keyframe automatically generated. Now if I scrub along, you'll see that skew, scrub along, you can see what's happening. Let's zoom in here. There's my skew being added. Now I want my skew to go back to 0 as the ball hits the ground. So I'm going to go to the next position keyframe as it touches down on the ground and set my skew back to 0. So it's going to skew in the direction of the arc, 0 as it touches the ground. And if I click off and on my shape layer, I can see the motion path. Let's go to the next position keyframe, add a 15-degree skew. Let's go ahead and make that 15. And as it reaches the peak of the arc, I want to 0 that. So the skew is a little bit of an extra polish. It gives the animation a little bit of personality. I'm going to keep going with this. As my arcs, as the height of the arc diminishes, I think it's going to want a little bit less skew with every bounce. So rather than 15 degrees, let's go something like 10. And back to 0 as it touches the ground. K for next keyframe. Click off and on to see my motion path. I'm just going to make this one 5 degrees as it really diminishes, as the skew really diminishes. Touch down. All right, at this point, let's take a quick look. Let's preview this. So now we've added a skew, sort of a stretch, if you will. Another thing I want to do is add a squash to the low position in the arc. I want to add a squash as the ball hits the ground. The scale property of the shape layer itself. So to get a little squash out of this, using my selection tool, I can change this bounding box shape, this bounding rectangle, and adjust the scaling on the layer. If you watch the parameters on your scale property as you do that, you'll see those parameters change. But if I make a change to that and scrub along my timeline, we'll quickly realize that we want to animate that property. So before we change it, let's go ahead and undo, reset the scale back to 100%. And since we want to animate that property, I'm going to activate the scale property for animation by clicking on the stopwatch next to the scale property. There's our scale keyframe that we've just created. And right now it's set to 100%. I'm going to put that keyframe just at the front of the timeline so it starts off at 100% scaling. Now I want to point out a shortcut for us that will help organize our animation. Rather than sort of expanding and digging through all these properties and all these controls and looking for our keyframes for this property and that property, there's an easy way to stay organized here. I'm going to select the layer, shortcut the letter U on my keyboard. Now it's going to only show me the properties that are being animated. So this will sort of help clean up our workspace. Whatever properties are activated here for animation, they will be the only ones visible. And you can always U to collapse, U to expand. You can always collapse and expand that layer. That'll pull up everything. For now, I'm going to U. Okay, so let's add some squish to this. So my initial scale keyframe is still set to 100%. I want to squish the ball as it hits the ground. So when it touches the ground, staying organized, keeping in this sort of column of frames here. I'm going to add some little bit of squish to that. Now, you'll notice if you scrub, we don't want the ball to squish until it hits down on the ground. So we can keep that from happening by simply turning this initial keyframe into a hold keyframe so that it holds 100% scale until we want it to change. I can do that by either shortcut Alt Command click on that keyframe or by right clicking the keyframe and toggle hold keyframe. Now we have a hold on the scale property at 100% until boom, we've hit our change. We've hit the next scale keyframe, and I think we want to lose the scale as soon as the ball leaves the ground. So on the very next frame, I want to reset the scale back to 100%. Since I've already got my skew animation working for me, I want to lose the squash. I want to lose the scale. Let's reset it back to 100%. I can do that here by sort of deconstraining the proportion and setting both parameters back to 100%. Or I can actually copy and paste a keyframe of the same property that I already know is set to the parameters I want. This initial keyframe is already set to 100%. So I'm going to select that keyframe and copy and paste it. So I'm going to select that keyframe and copy and paste it where I like. So Command C for copy, and it's going to paste it wherever my playhead is located along my timeline. The very frame after the bounce, paste that keyframe right there. So now my scale is reset back to 100%. Now if I scrub through, there's my skewing in action working for me. No scaling yet. Scale is still 100%. It's being held by this hold keyframe. And then as soon as it hits the next scale keyframe, which I have changed, there's my squish. Very next frame, I have it at 100% again. And my skew continues to work for me. So I want the same thing happening at the next point where the ball hits the ground. I think I'll just select these two frames and copy and paste them, Command C. And since this is the point where I want to paste them, right where the ball hits the ground, I'll just Command V, paste it right there. So again, we have a held keyframe, held scale keyframe at 100%. No scale, no scale, no scale until it hits the next keyframe. And the very next frame, again, is the same hold keyframe that we pasted. There's my skew in action. I think I want a little bit less squash for every bounce. So I need to select only the keyframe that I want to change and adjust the scale here, just get a little bit less squash out of it, since that's going to diminish with every bounce. I'm just going to preview this animation and see what we've got so far. That's looking pretty good. Let's just add just a hair, just a tad bit of squash to that last bounce. So at this point in my timeline, I think I'll just go ahead and copy the last two scale keyframes, copy, paste them right here. And to diminish the scaling on this frame, remember to only select the keyframe you want to change, not both keyframes selected, just the one keyframe. Let's just lose a little bit of that squash. And I think that's about it for our squashing. So let's preview this again. All right, so hopefully you've got a working bouncing ball animation. We've got some squash and stretch in there, some skewing, some personality to that ball. Next thing I want to add is sound effect. Let's pause that preview. Let's save our file. So to add a sound effect, we have to import a sound file. And in order to import, we can go up to File, Import, or Command I. I'm going to look for my sound file that I've downloaded called boing.mp4. Let's go ahead and import that. So you should see your imported file here in your project panel next to our composition. When you're working with larger projects, this project panel can get pretty filled up. You'll have all kinds of movie files, sound files, all kinds of compositions. You'll eventually want to stay organized by using these folders. So sort of create a new folder here, call it sound effects. I can drag my sound files to that folder. So now I have a little bit of organization here, just food for thought. So using sound file, pretty simple to get our sound effect into the project. We simply drag the sound clip from our project panel either onto our composition background here or into the layer panel, into the timeline panel, anywhere we like. Pretty much anywhere you drop it, it's going to land. So here's our sound effect layer. Real quick, let's just go ahead and preview that. Okay. So I know that I need at least 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5, about 4 or 5 bounce sound effects. Real quick, I just want to look at the properties of this sound file, this sound layer, this MP4 layer. I'm going to expand, and we have some audio controls. Expand that. We have audio levels. It's going to be our volume. Expand the waveform, and this will help us see what the waveform of the sound looks like. So that'll be helpful. So we can see, we can better align the audio clip along our timeline. It'll help us align with the animation. So I know I'm going to want 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 bounce sounds. I can simply, with my sound layer selected, copy, paste, paste, paste. Just paste your sound layer a few times to get some duplicates. And you can drag the layer along your timeline and time it to match the animation. So let's really quick preview this so far. Okay, obviously we need to, if I go ahead and expand all 4, by the way, for now, I'm going to collapse the ball shape layer because I'm done with that animation. Let's collapse that, we'll hide that. And I want to look at the waveforms for my sound files. So let's just expand the waveform control. For my sound clips, that will help me align my sound to my animation. So I know I want to bounce sound right there. So let's take the first boing.mp4 sound clip and match the waveform to this frame. Let's just have that happen there. And if we scrub forward in our timeline, we want another bounce sound right there. So I'll move my next audio boing.mp4, align my waveform with that frame. Let's scrub forward. I want to bounce sound right there. There. I'm going to grab the next boing.mp4, align waveform with the animation, and finally another bounce over here. I'm going to drag this audio sound layer and align the waveform with this frame. So let's preview that. Okay, we're close. One thing I think I want to do is diminish the volume for each consecutive bounce. So I'll keep the first bounce as is at 0+ decibels. If we look at our timeline, we've got 4 audio layers. I'm going to adjust the decibel level on the audio level property for each of these sound files, each of these sound layers. The first one will be loudest, and the second one will be a little bit softer, and then a little softer and a little softer. Okay, so I've simply changed the decibel level on my audio files, on my audio layers. I'm going to preview. Let's see what that sounds like. I think that's sounding good. I've left the first decibel level. I've left the first one at 0. I've brought the second one down to -8 decibels on that audio level property. I've made the next one -24 decibels. And the last one is down to -40. So one more time, I'm going to preview that. I think that drop off is good, but I'm noticing a little bit of scratchy extra sound. And if I look at the waveform, I can actually see a little bit of extra sound happening in this audio file that I don't want. So what I can do is I can cut this layer off by selecting the layer on the timeline and pulling the end of the layer in on the timeline. That will let me cut off the audio wherever I want. And I want to cut it off right there. So what's going to happen, I can do the same thing for any layer. I think I see a little bit of extra audio happening on the second layer too. So I'm going to do the same thing for that layer. I'm going to pull in the end of the layer. I'm going to pull in the end of the audio clip on the timeline, cut it off right there. And I think for the last two, I've diminished the audio so much that it won't make a difference. I think it won't be necessary on any more of the audio clips, but let's preview that. Yeah, so I've lost that extra fuzz by shortening the duration of the audio clip. Let's preview that again. So far, so good. So, yeah, so the only thing left I want to add to polish this animation is motion blur. I'm going to collapse all these audio clips. Collapse, 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 collapse. So there's a super simple way to add a basic default motion blur to any object that has any movement animation on it. Remember earlier we took a look at these three buttons down here at the bottom left of our layer panel. You can toggle each one on and off, and each one shows and hides. I'm just going to turn all three on. Each one is responsible for a unique set of controls for your layers. So let's make sure we have the leftmost pane button here at the bottom left of the layers panel selected. So that's going to show, you'll notice that'll show us this set of symbols. So in order to use a motion blur, the sort of automated default motion blur, we have to do two things. You'll notice this set of icons or symbols and a similar set of symbols just above that at the top of the layers panel. In order to activate or turn on motion blur for any given layer, we have to do two things. First, find the motion blur switch. It's the symbol that actually looks like a ball bouncing. This circle sort of looks like a moving circle or a series of circles stacked. So the first thing we need to do, and you'll find an identical looking symbol in next set of icons just above. So these two motion blur symbols are corresponding to each other. So two things we need to do. One is find the motion blur switch. One is to activate motion blur for the layer of our choosing, in this case the ball layer. So go down from the motion blur switch to the ball layer. You'll find an empty checkbox. Click. So that activates the motion blur switch for that layer. We don't have any motion blur yet. What we need to do is now go to the larger set of icons above at the top of the layers panel, find the corresponding symbol for motion blur and click that. What that does is enable motion blur. It enables motion blur for any layer that we have motion blur switch set on for. In this case, the only layer that we've switched on motion blur for is our ball layer. So that's the only layer that's going to get any motion blur. We could activate motion blur for our floor layer, but that floor is not moving at all. So that would be useless. So we've switched on, we've enabled the motion blur symbol in the larger set of icons here. And yeah, if you look at your circle, at your ball, you'll already notice a motion blur effect applied. And if you preview your animation, you should notice that motion blur on it. And if you pause preview at any point, there's your motion blur. There's your motion blur effect applied to the ball. So yeah, there you have it. Hopefully you've got a working ball animation that's got a bounce sound effect and some skewing, some squashing, stretching, and motion blur. Yeah, so that should cover the basics of finding our way through some of the functionality of of animating in After Effects, some of the different tools, different panels, some of the different properties, and using keyframes and animating, using different kinds of keyframes, hold keyframes, auto in between keyframes. And that's about it for this tutorial. I hope that you've got a nice working animation. I hope you've at least found this tutorial useful, helpful, and that concludes After Effects for animating for beginners. Thanks for watching.